Welcome everybody to those watching on YouTube to another speedrun episode. We'll start with a 10-minute game, and then we'll see how it goes. This is on the tail end of a very long stream, so can't promise a long episode, but hopefully we get some instructive games in. Let's get this show on the road. We have the white pieces. Scandi B. Patu from India, e4. And we have ourselves an Alapin. Let's see what our opponent cooks up in response. So knight c6, very, very common move at this level. Obviously, this doesn't change our strategy. We play d4. Amazingly enough, black is already... Okay, in trouble is a strong word. But unless black knows basically reams of theory, yes, black is already in serious trouble. So e6 is a very common treatment of the position at this level. But we've already gotten exactly what we want. We get the full pawn center. And we get just like lovely development for our minor pieces. Lovely and very natural development. So at this point, there's a choice that we can make. The kind of vanilla move, the meat and potatoes move, is just to play knight c3 or knight f3 and, to solidify the small advantage. But if we want to play for maximum, there is a move that we can make here. And you probably see this move and maybe you're thinking, well, we haven't developed any pieces, so probably this is premature. But it's actually not premature to play this move, because it really makes it incredibly difficult for black to complete their queenside development, and it makes it difficult for black to stake a claim in the center, because black's next move is very likely going to be d7, d5. So what I'm talking about is for us to play d5 ourselves. This is a very, very nasty move that can lead to a quick victory. Obviously, we recapture with a pawn, and already black is on the cusp of losing this game, believe it or not, depending on where the knight goes. So why are we doing this? What justifies the move d5 in the absence of any piece development? Well, the fact of the matter is that black also doesn't have a lot of development. Black has only developed one piece. It's just the knight. And this is not a very serious threat to, the safety of our king. So again, we're trying to make it as difficult as possible for black to get the queenside out. And potentially in some positions, we can even push this pawn all the way up to d6, which creates a very nasty situation for black, where a check along the e-file is going to lead to immediate material gain, because black will simply not be able to block that check without giving up a piece. So now we have an important moment, because if we push d6 prematurely, then we really start lagging behind a development, and I wouldn't fixate on trying to win material out of the opening. We have to kind of combine this ambitious central play with straightforward and very active piece development. And there's a lot of ways that we can play this position. A lot of different ways. We can transition back to normal development with knight c3 or knight f3. Bishop f4 might be on your radar as well. You might be thinking about the move queen e2 here, trying to pick off the knight with an f-pawn. But after queen e2, queen e7, how are we going to win that knight? It's going to be a little bit difficult. There's a little bit of calculation to do here, so I'm just trying to figure this out. There. Wow, this is really interesting. I'm thinking whether to include the move queen e2, and I'm leaning toward not including it. I also really dislike the move f4. It's an incredibly weakening move, and it's only a move that you would play if on the next move you delivered a check on e2, which we're not going to do. So, as much as you might be looking forward to, exciting play in the center, let's just transition to straightforward development with knight c3. Okay, just bringing our pieces out. The pawn on d5 is well protected, and g6. Okay, so our opponent is really asking for it. As a matter of fact, this move just loses a piece. And it probably loses a piece several different ways, but there is a very straightforward way to pick off the knight. Now, one thing that you should have noticed when you were looking at f4 is that the knight only has one square. It only has the g6 square. So the moment a pawn lands on that square, immediately the alarm bells should start ringing. f4 traps the knight in the center, and it only took us 8 moves to attain a winning position in the Alapin. Now, newer players who are watching might be wondering, am I not worried about a check on h4? Definitely not. Check on h4, we just block with g3. Black drops an entire minor piece, and then we're going to complete our development with knight f3. So there's a kind of a lot of variations in this position. So you might be a little bit confused, why didn't we play one move? So I was trying to play as simple as possible. Just develop a piece and give our opponent some rope. Now it's time to snag the knight. and then quickly transition to completing our development. Now, obviously, this bishop can be targeted with queen e2, but, there's no need to overcomplicate the process. We've already gotten a minor piece in our pocket. Now, we just need to complete our development. And actually, the way that black is playing, we don't just want to blindly develop random pieces. We can actually play for maximum here. I'm looking at this e file. A check on e2 could potentially be very devastating. If we give the check right now, black can block with a queen. And yeah, a queen trade is probably good for us, but there's many, many other ways to maximize our advantage that don't involve a queen trade. And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to either play bishop g5, but even better, to push the pawn up to d6 now. Yeah, d6 is absolutely devastating, and now it's very, very important to play queen e2 check, because if we follow up with a move like bishop g5, then black is able to basically work around the pawn. Black can castle, and then black can play b6 and fianchetto the bishop. But the point of d6 is to deliver this incredibly nasty check on e2, forcing the king to the side, and black is utterly devastated. Now we simply continue our development. So what's the most active way in which we continue our development? Well, clearly it's bishop g5, pinning the knight. h6, bishop h4. Yeah, black is just dead lost down a piece, and we have a devastating initiative, and black just dropped another piece. So obviously this allows a check on e7. I'm trying to see if we can win the game in style, though. There's some really lovely mating patterns, but we'll save them for our higher rated exploits. Let's give the check on e7. Let's wrap this game up. Now, the fastest path to checkmate here, I think, is not to take on f6. Who can tell me what it is? What is actually the fastest path to checkmate here? To my knowledge, maybe I'm wrong, but this move should lead to checkmate in just a couple moves. It's actually to hit this f7 pawn, either with bishop c4, but even better is to play the move knight e5. Like, if you want to be ultra accurate, you go knight e5. Black simply cannot defend this pawn. And once we take this pawn, it's either checkmate on the spot, or if black plays h6, we capture on f7, capture on g6, then bring the light squared bishop out, and then deliver checkmate on the next move. It's all over. Yeah. I think our opponent's going to resign. Now, this game really reminds me in a pretty direct way of a quick miniature that I won many years ago, and I've shown that game before on stream as kind of an advertisement for the Alapin. So I'll show it again after our opponent resigns. Yeah, actually uncanny similarity with the game that I'm referencing. So before we even delve into the analysis, let me just show you what game I'm referring to. Let me see if I can dig it up really quickly. It's from 2005. This was one of the shortest tournament games that I've ever won, 13 moves. Okay, so this was a game that I played against the 1700 in Vegas in 2005, and a long time ago. And here's how the game went. So I had just started playing the Alapin, maybe like a year or so before this game. Yeah, I've been playing the Alapin for a very, very long time. Here's what happens. So e4, c5, c3, knight c6. There you go. So the same exact sequence. And here I actually played knight f3. Later, when I analyzed with an engine, I found that d5 is the best move. So I actually knew this. But I played knight f3. My opponent goes knight f6. I went knight c3. And here, black commits the decisive error. He has to play d5. And after e5, you get like a very, very good version of the advanced French. Black is clearly worse, but obviously black is not losing. Black can also go bishop b4, and we've actually faced this position in the speedrun, and we play bishop d3. We had a game like this, d5, e5. I think our opponent went knight e4. And here I want to say we went queen c2, but you can dig it up. My opponent plays bishop to e7. And who can tell me why this move loses on the spot? And now it should be very obvious to you, because you're kind of primed to look for this idea. Yeah, well, obviously d5, trade on d5, knight b4, and now a more difficult question for people. Should white play d6? Why or why not? You should pause the video if you're watching on YouTube and see if you can figure this out. Is d6 a good move here? Or should you throw in an intermezzo like a3? So what do people think? So a lot of people are saying a3 first, and a3 first is all right. You can play a3 first, but I was a little bit worried about the queen coming out to a5, and suddenly things kind of get complicated. In fact, d6 is the most straightforward winning move. And some of you were like, well, what about bishop takes d6? And you stopped calculating because you saw that the rook in the corner disappears. But that's not the central aspect of the position. It's a trick question because white simply takes on d6. Congratulations, you give up the rook on a1. And after bishop c4, the game is over because the rook is coming to e1 and black is simply checkmated or loses, grievous amounts of material. Just look at this position. My opponent tried knight e4. Of course, I can take the knight, but I went with a clinical move, rook e1, and here he resigned. Just because black is getting devastated on the e-file. So very important not to have this snap reaction like, oh, I can't take the bishop because of knight c2. If you've got this kind of a lead in development, you should keep calculating. Like the rook in the corner is not essential. So this is why I knew this idea with d5, d6. There's many other instances where this kind of thing occurs. Let's go back to the speedrun game. One very common opening that I see at like the intermediate level is people who go knight c6, d4, or the beginner level, cd, cd, and then they go g6. I've seen this played quite a bit. And most people, they go knight c3, and after bishop g7, black is okay. But again, the best move is actually to push the pawn to go d5. And if black plays knight e5, you literally trap the knight, just like we did with f4. So black has to go all the way back to b8. Now a very powerful move is to develop the queen to d4 and prevent black from fianchettoing. I think I might have even talked about this line. Knight f6, e5, pushing the knight away again. Knight h5, for example, knight c3. Now you develop your pieces, and white is completely dominating in the center. Black cannot move, because any developing move is going to result in black losing a piece. So the takeaway is, when you're an Alapin player, or in general, when you control the center, don't just like close your eyes and develop your pieces. Understand that advancing your pawn sometimes, even when you're not fully developed, can be totally devastating if your opponent has developed their pieces awkwardly. So that's why d5 is so strong. So we want d5. E takes d5 is a mistake. Or actually, no, it's not a mistake. Knight e5, I think, is a follow-up error. Or actually, no, I'm checking with the engine right now. Knight e5, knight c3. The evaluation is about 0.6. But black has to play with computer precision in order to essentially not be lost. And the most popular move here is knight f6. And yet again, d6 is tremendously powerful in this position. d6 again. Now you might say, well, isn't this pawn a serious weakness? Can't black go queen b6, for example? Well, what happens after queen b6? The knight jumps into b5. Now white is threatening a devastating fork on c7. There's no good way to defend against it. If you slide the king over, now I'm coming out with the bishop. The rook is coming to c1. Black is dead lost. There's one game in the database that I see in this position. It's from 2015, and black played queen to a5. White responded with pawn to f4. But I think a better idea would have been to go bishop f4, trying to pick off this knight. Black is also completely lost. For example, knight g6. I don't know. Reasonable move. Now, yeah, simply bishop g3, and black is totally paralyzed. Completely paralyzed. This bishop is simply never getting out, ever. h5, you don't care about that at all. You can just go h4 and lock up the king side. So a good idea to keep in your pocket. And so according to the computer, the only way for black to maintain a feasible position is bishop to b4. Got to get your bishop out before white plays d6. Now white is supposed to play knight to f3, simply continuing the development. And here again, it's very, very easy to blunder. d6 gives up the bishop. So black has to play a very computerish move, queen to e7. Knight takes e5, queen takes e5, bishop to e2. And now here again, if black gets greedy and snaps off the pawn, then white gets this massive development advantage, as well as the dark squares and the bishop pair. So this is really bad for black too. So black has to play knight f6, castles, castles. And finally, black has gotten the king to safety. But after rook e1, white gets a big, big initiative in the center. And if black plays bishop c3, bc, and queen takes d5, black has gotten rid of the pawn, but at great cost. You actually trade queens here. You play the move bishop f3, sacrificing another pawn, but you've got complete and total domination over black's position. Knight takes c3, bishop a3. Now the black rook doesn't have any good squares, and after rook d8, an exercise for the viewer, white to play and win. Pause the video, see if you can figure out the simple forced winning sequence. So the first move is pretty obvious. The second move can be slightly challenging. Yeah, sup YouTube. Bishop e7 is correct, rook e8, and now dropping the bishop back to b4 with a double attack on the e8 square as well as against the knight. White wins the game. And what is the underlying problem in black's position throughout all of these variations? It's, again, the fact that the queen side is, and I'm highlighting the rook, I really should be highlighting the light squared bishop. It's completely undeveloped. And it's like one side of your brain is not communicating with the other, so there's only so much that black can do. So that's the best computer line. Our opponent lost the game immediately. G6, F4. And in general, remember that trapping the knight in the center of the board is a very easy concept to forget about. I think people blunder this kind of thing really, really often. Just because a piece is in the center of the board does not mean it's sort of inoculated against getting trapped. And here the game is just over. Knight F3, developing, D6, shoving the pawn through, check on E2, developing, check, and Knight E5 with easy checkmate. Someone was asking what happens after Queen E2 check, Queen E7, D6. Yeah, this is a viable way to play. You can also do this, and you can basically play the same position with queens off the board. This is also completely winning. Many roads lead to Rome. Okay, pretty simple game. Let's get another one in. Any questions? Okay, one more game. This time we're black. Let's keep the ball rolling. Okay, so 1d3. I don't remember if we faced this move before or not. Now, there's a million ways that you can respond to d3. It depends on what your opening repertoire is. We're going to go e5 because it's sort of the most principled move. Our opponent, though, is not playing this in the traditional fashion. Typically, d3 at a high level, if it is played on the first move, which is rare, it transposes pretty quickly to a different opening, like the English or the King's Indian attack. So this move has very little independent value. But our opponent seems to be playing a hippo setup. Well, we know how to respond to that. Okay, bishop to d2. That is a very awkward move. It doesn't really change the way that we develop. We start with knight f6, just like we do against the hippo. Knight f3. And here you might be tempted to play e4. You might be like, well, this is just like the previous game, right? You want to stake your claim in the center. But no, the situation's a little bit different here because the pawn doesn't really have any path forward. Like, if you play e4, you're not really going to go e3 after that. And you're actually just giving up a bunch of squares in the center. So those of you who've watched the speedrun attentively know that I don't love the move knight c6 in this type of position because I want to reserve the ability to move the pawn up to c6, creating this nice little pawn chain in the center. So my favorite way of defending this pawn is to play bishop to d6. Okay, knight c3. And here is a perfect example of a situation in which knight c6 is obviously fine, but I really think c6 is a very effective move because it restricts the knight, solidifies the pawn, and in general, we just have a very, very nice scheme of development. Queen e2. Okay, our opponent is doing something very strange. Let's just continue developing. Castle's kingside. Knight g5. Okay, time to punish this. Now this is starting to cross the line from, really bad play into like WTF is our opponent doing. And I actually think I know what our opponent is doing. This kind of move should be familiar to people. I think our opponent is trying to set up a fishing pole trap. And I'm actually going to walk into it. I'm going to go h6. And I think our opponent wants to go h4. Yes. So clearly our opponent learned this trap in a book somewhere and now is trying to carry it out as many times as possible. Now, this is a much feared type of trap. People don't like to deal with this, but they forget in many cases one very important thing, which is that a lot of people just assume that the knight cannot be captured in this type of situation. But that is not in fact the case. In many, many cases, the knight can and should be captured because white simply doesn't have the sufficient attacking firepower to deliver an attack on the h-file. Or very often you can simply prevent the white queen from even accessing the h5 square. So let's grab the knight. And I'm going to show you how to punish this kind of play. Now, the worst move in the position for black would be just to drop the knight back to e8. Then we would get mated. The queen would come to h5. And as you've probably experienced, if you move the f-pawn up, white pushes g6. I've talked about this type of scenario, and mate is inevitable on the h-file. But much like with the Greek gift sacrifice, the presence of the move bishop f5 can be a saving grace in this type of position. Because once the bishop comes out to f5, if there is a knight on h7, this is a very stable defensive construction that essentially plugs the h-file. So one option is to play knight to h7, the best move in chess. And white is already out of attacking ideas. Queen h5, our opponent gets excited. Boom. Now notice, if white pushes e4, which is probably going to happen, I think our opponent might play g4. The bishop has the g6 square. Bishop g6, it's on a protected square, and that's it. We have successfully dealt with our opponent's attack. If white plays pawn g6, we just play bishop takes g6. We don't play pawn takes g6 because then that interferes with the connection with the knight, and we win the game. Okay, g3. I think our opponent is trying to go bishop h3, which is a sensible idea, but it doesn't really do anything. In addition, we can, if we are so inclined, take on g5 with the queen. We can also drop the bishop back to g6 and park it on a solid square. There's a million ways to win this position. We don't want our opponent to hang over us forever, right? Because the longer these types of tactical situations persist, the higher the probability that eventually you're going to blunder something or you're accidentally going to release this knight. So let's not procrastinate. Let's take on g5. Let's try to disarm this construction as soon as we possibly can. Queen h2. Okay, now we have to be on alert because e4 is a big threat. Well, it's a big threat because it exposes an attack on the queen and it opens up the center, which is definitely not something we want to allow. How should we deal with the threat of e4? Who can tell me? How should we deal with that? What is the most efficient, most foolproof way of preventing white from opening the center? Yeah, now it's time for us to play e4 ourselves, just plugging this bishop on, burying this bishop on d2. And this pawn is actually very well protected on e4, so we don't have to worry about losing it. We're also opening up an x-ray on the white queen, so there's no g4. And now we can proceed to the final stage of the operation, which is fully disarming, taking the sting out of this annoying little construction on the h-file. So to do that, one mechanism involves just bringing the knight up to f6. But if you look very carefully, knight to d7 is actually a bit of an inaccuracy. Why is knight d7 an inaccuracy? This is a good exercise for after the game. I'm not going to talk about it right now. Right now, what we're going to do is we're going to think. We're going to think about this. I want to find the most clinical way of dealing with all of the threats here. I really like the move. Okay, I like queen g6 here. Yeah, I really like queen g6. We could have also started with queen h6 and then slid the queen to g6. What does this move do? Right? How do you come up with such a move? What is the purpose of it? Well, basically, this is a solidifying move because I'm protecting the bishop on d6. Why is that important? In the event that the the d file opens, I don't want this bishop to be loose. The second thing is that after bishop h3, which our opponent has just played, we can calmly trade the bishop on h3, and the knight on h7 is still defended. So now we can make another move to build up our defensive bastions on the king side. Here we have an excellent way to do just that. Remember that in order to take the sting out of this construction on the h-file, all we really have to do is create a Luft square for the black king, and then we can actually safely move the knight. So don't go knight g5 immediately. Start with f5. This has the positive byproduct of cementing the e4 pawn. So if white takes on e4, we take with the f pawn, keeping the center closed. And now we're finally ready to jump into g5 with the knight. And we are not fearing a check on h8 because the king just slides out to f7. Now, we don't have to play knight g5. That's not mandatory. But I will do that just to demonstrate how futile a check on h8 actually is. And now look at white's bishop. Totally buried, totally useless. And we're officially scot-free. So we're up a piece. We've disarmed the attack, queen to d7. Okay, so I actually briefly, this move flickered across my mind, and then I was like, wait, we have a knight on b8 that we have not yet developed. Now we've developed it. And now we'll start taking stuff. Rook takes f2. Okay, rook g2. Yeah, I wish white would resign here, but I don't think he's going to. Yeah, this is interesting, actually. The engine, wow, this is really cool. So we'll have some interesting analysis to do after the game. I'm looking at the engine, and actually, it's not, it's not arguing, it's arguing against taking the knight on g5. It doesn't believe that it's the fastest path to victory. So, wow, the engine line is crazy. Okay, we have a lot to explore as soon as our opponent abandons this pitiful position. No, I'm looking at the start of the game, not looking at the end of the game. Yes, I'll wait for the game to finish. Okay, takes on e1, takes on c2. Nothing to discuss here. We're just taking all of white's pieces. It's unfortunate that white is not resigning, but I think Clyde will fast forward this in the YouTube video. Okay, let's go here. Doubling up on the second rank. Okay, knight d1. It's funny, our opponent is defending very resiliently. Bishop e5. Let's win with a flourish. All right. Okay, it's just made in a couple moves here. Rook takes b2. Actually, here, interestingly, the fastest way to mate is not to move the rook along the b file. It's to go queen d6. All right, so you don't always have to automatically deliver some sort of a discovered check. You can just keep the rook on b2 like this because it keeps the king confined and bring over the queen, delivering checkmate. White finally can deliver a check on h8, but it doesn't do anything. Okay, another check. We can block with our knight. A lot to discuss here because this type of fishing pole trap is very popular at beginner to intermediate level. It's good to know how to disarm these sorts of things. Okay, check. Bishop takes. Okay, takes. No stalemate. White has pawns. A lot of pawns. A lot of pawns. And finally, it's checkmate. Okay, so I was actually just pulling up an example of something that I wanted to show. Let's start with a general point. When you learn these types of traps like the fishing pole or the Greek gift, often you learn about them from the perspective of the side that's springing the trap or that's executing the combination, and you don't learn about the scenarios in which the combination actually doesn't work. So in the context of the Greek gift sacrifice, I've talked about the kind of checklist that you have to go down to ensure that a Greek gift sacrifice works. And a lot of people forget that it doesn't work in every scenario. So here's a simple example. I know that this is slightly off topic, but this will segue nicely. This is a simul game that Josero Capablanca gave in Berlin in 1911. But Capablanca is clearly not taking his opponent seriously. He goes g4, trying to establish the hierarchy on the king's side, trying to show black who's boss. But his opponent clearly turns out to be a very decent player. How does black punish Capablanca's premature pawn sortie? Very thematic type of idea by black. Actually really impressive. Yeah, e5 blasting through in the center and actually just sacking the bishop on e5. Because white's position is kind of in shambles despite being down a piece. But Capablanca comes up with a really clever idea. He goes knight f3. Now, this is actually a blunder because black is able to trade and then replace one knight with the other, and white is overloaded. These two pieces are hanging, but Capablanca thought that he had anticipated it, and he had thought that he could transition this into a Greek gift sacrifice. What was the flaw in his reasoning? What was the flaw in his reasoning? Yeah, bishop f5 is coming. Knight g5, and suddenly the bishop comes out to f5, and just like in our game, the bishop parks itself on g6, and then black transitions to an attack and wins the game pretty quickly. Now, some situations are even more complicated and even more involved. Here's an old game in which white thought that he had anticipated the bishop f5 idea. Kennedy versus Williams, 1847. This position, white is down a pawn, but tries to turn the tables with a Greek gift sacrifice, takes knight g5. Now, I think king g6 is probably winning here, but black drops the king back. This falls into the trap. Queen h5, bishop f5, and white had anticipated that and had prepared the move rook h3. And it seems like the bishop is overloaded, right? You're threatening checkmate, and now you can't take the rook because of mate. But white's king is also equally weak, and so black jumps into the attack, queen f4 check, and that is a devastating check. Because after king g1, queen d4, black picks up the rook with a mating attack. White had to block with his own rook, queen d4 check, and simply bishop g6. The attack is disarmed. So remember, don't just try to blindly apply these tactical patterns because the smallest detail can cause them to fail. Let's go back to our game. So I first learned about the fishing pole trap pretty late in my career when I was 1800. I was playing the World Youth Under 10 in France, and Joel Benjamin, American Grandmaster, he showed me this very famous line in the Exchange Ruy Lopez, because I was playing the Exchange with white at the time. And this might be the most famous kind of manifestation of the fishing pole idea. And here it's actually a legitimate line, h3, h5. So this line has been very well known for over 100 years. And in this case, taking on g4 essentially loses the game. Black recaptures, the knight is under fire, and if white takes the pawn, then the same thing happens. Queen h4, f4, and g3, sealing off the king. So white is not supposed to take this bishop. White can go d4, white can go d3, but here the bishop is essentially untouchable. Okay? Now let's go to our game. d3, e5. Okay, e3, our opponent playing very poorly in the opening, and setting up the fishing pole with knight g5. So after we played h6, h4, according to the computer, taking the knight was not the most accurate option. The most accurate option is actually to play the move e4, which looks like absolute madness. I mean, why are we giving up why are we voluntarily opening up the center? Watch this. Bishop g4 as a follow-up. Now, obviously, if white blocks with a knight, then we just play d and we win a piece. But this also looks very foolish because we're walking right into f3. And you might be like, oh, well, is the idea to deliver a check? Well, what does this check do? It doesn't do anything. Looks like black has just dug himself into a major hole. But try to find the move that makes everything work. It's an engine move, but it's actually a lovely idea. It's a positional idea. You're provoking the weakness of the g3 square. But instead of occupying it with the bishop, what do you do? When you view it in that context, the move starts to make sense. Not knight takes e4, but actually knight to h5. Yeah, knight to h5, just sinking our teeth into this square. And amazingly, white has no good way to stop the fork. So first of all, if white takes the bishop, the knight jumps into g3. Okay, the queen has to move. It moves up to f3. We take the rook. And now the knight on g5 is hanging. There's no rook to act. Now the knight is literally hanging because there's nothing on the h-file, and it has nowhere good to go. If white drops the knight back, then we take another pawn on h4, and black is completely winning. The knight is easily evacuated back via g3. But here's the second part. If white plays rook to g1 and tries to get the rook out of the line of fire of the knight, black plays bishop g3 check, and then bishop h2. And obviously, if rook h1, then knight g3. And if white plays fg, a lot of pieces are hanging, but black actually goes knight g3, queen f3, for example, h takes g5, and the rook is trapped on g1. Black wins the exchange, and white's position collapses. Yeah, how did I not see that? I mean, your chess instruction is in very bad hands. Pretty crazy computer line here, but still, it shows us how rich the game is. Yeah, I didn't think about bishop g4 at all. I mean, this move briefly occurred to me, but I was like, oh, well, white plays f3. This is stupid. By the way, if white moves the queen, then we can go knight to a6, and the knight is infiltrating either to c5 or to b4, and the queen could get trapped here. So instead, I took the knight, and after h3, I played knight to h7. Now, there's many other ways to deal with the fishing pole. One of them involves literally blocking the diagonal with knight to g4. The problem with this move is that white plays f3 and the knight is trapped. So here you would have to give the knight away with queen takes g5, and in return you would get two pawns, and black is better. White's attack has been successfully dealt with. Black can play f5 on the next move, and black is much better, but not winning. So instead we played the more materialistic option, knight h7. And the main idea is after queen h5, bishop f5, white's attack is starting to fizzle out. So our opponent played g3, which essentially loses the game. It's too slow. But according to the computer, it's only like minus 1.5 if white plays the calm move bishop to e2. And the detail here that is hard to anticipate is that queen takes g5 enables white to win back the piece. How? What should white do in this position? Yeah, not e4 immediately. E4 immediately, I can trade queens and move the bishop. First, white has to take the queen. And then white plays e4 with a double attack on the two minors. And after DE, black is still better. I mean, black is a better endgame, but at least you're not losing. So to maximize our advantage, we would have to play rook to e8. White would castle to the queen side, or castle to the east. And we would complete our development with knight d7. And this brings me to another very important idea, the knight coming back to f8. So when you have a piece on h7, you want to make sure that it's very well protected. And you want to remember that g4 is almost never dangerous because you can just drop the bishop back. And yeah, white's probably losing here. According to the computer, the best move is bishop to g4 instead of pawn to g4. And here, you can actually play a very fearless move. What should black do in this position? Trick question. Last question before we move on. Not up or draw. What should black play in this position? So not pawn to... You almost never play pawn to g6 because that's always going to drop the knight. You take the bishop. Yeah, you take the bishop. So again, this is something you should drill into your brain, that this is not always scary, right? Just because the king is driven out into the center does not mean it's like imminent checkmate. White has to play f3, the bishop drops back, and black is completely fine. If white plays f4, then we can play g6 to cover the f5 square. And then the king can safely hide away in the center. But we don't play bishop g6 here because now the queen drops back to h3. And now white has this very nasty idea to push f4, f5. And here, black is actually in some pretty deep trouble. So definitely very scary, right? It's scary to grab this sort of material. And the takeaway is, listen, if you have a situation like this and you're not sure, just ignore the piece. Play a move like rook e8. Play a move like b5, start an attack on the other side of the board. Right? Play a move like knight a6. You don't have to accept, the fishing pole or any other sacrifice. But what I wanted to show you is that very often people are afraid of ghosts and they just assume that this is always going to be losing. But the reality is very far from that. Anyways, last thing is noticing the x-rays, right? Not blundering into e4, but pushing e4 ourselves. And the last thing I wanted to spotlight is this moment, right? Where knight d7 would be a serious inaccuracy because after the trade on e4, white drops the bishop back to e1, and suddenly black is kind of overloaded. This bishop on f5, it's protecting h7. It's also protecting d7. So this would simply blunder a piece. So black would have to play a move like queen g6, but now things get very, very flimsy, right? The bishop is loose. The knight, white could even play queen h7. So for that reason, I decided to first drop my queen back to g6 just to eliminate any shenanigans, kind of wait for white to put their cards on the table. And in the event that white did the same thing, now we can actually move the bishop away. And we can develop the knight through a6. Or through d7, actually, at this point. Any questions? Yeah, I feel like people are getting a headache from looking at all these variations. And of course, remember the move f5. Pushing the f-pawn gives the king this path to heaven, which is away from the king's side. But also remember that it doesn't always solve your problem. Previously in a speedrun episode, I showed you a famous combination where black tried to create this escape route for the king, but then Alapin had seen one step further. Yeah, so this is Alapin versus Mendeno from a simul game. This is not a very well-known game, actually. Yeah, thanks to the person who uploaded this into a Lichess study, I was able to download it. So watch what happens in this game really, really quickly. So Alapin plays a Ruy Lopez. Black plays pretty badly. This is a simul game. Here, Alapin simply leaves his bishop on g5, and black takes it. This is bad. Alapin opens up the h-file, and now he starts to double rooks on the h-file. And black plays queen e6, rook to h1, and Mendeno plays f5, the move that I've advised you to play in these situations. And here, it's white to play and win. Alapin comes up with a really precise sequence. The move order is extremely important in this game because there's several wrong move orders that lose the game for white. White to play. White to play. Okay, so even if you've seen this before, it's easy to get confused. This is in the art of checkmate. Aha, very interesting. Okay, so the move is, drum roll please, the move is knight to e5. It's knight to e5. Sacrificing the knight. Black plays d takes e5, and now you play g6. Now you play g6, threatening rook h8 mate, queen takes g6. And the reason you played knight e5 was to deliver a check with the queen, forcing black to put something on f7 and allowing white to mate on h8. Beautiful concept. Now, why were the other move orders wrong? A lot of people, when they look at this position, they think one of several things. Either they come up with this idea, rook h8, queen g7, thinking this is mate. It's not. Black gets king g6, and black actually wins. This is not mate either. The king is a hard piece to catch. Some people think, it's a deflection. I go queen c4, queen takes c4, and now I go g6. What is wrong with this idea? What's wrong with this idea? Isn't rook h8 inevitable? So it's not d5. Black actually has a win in this position. Yeah, queen f1 check. Deflecting the rook, or you take the rook on the next move, and now you have a tempo, and you can use this tempo to evacuate the king several different ways. You can go knight f6, you can do a bunch of things. Rook e8 and king f8, that kind of stuff. Then other people think, why not start with g6 and now play queen c4? Well, here black has the move d5. This is why we needed to play knight e5 in the initial position. And finally, if after knight e5, if you start with g6 and then play knight e5, remember the correct sequence is to start with knight e5. If you do it in the opposite move order, you're giving black a chance to take on h5. This is actually the easiest thing to miss. And black actually gets a ton of material for the queen. The position is completely unclear. The move order, very important. And all of this should make sense to you. Even if you're a beginner, you start with knight e5, d takes e5. If queen takes e5, by the way, you can actually just trade queens and then go g6. So black has to take with a pawn, g6, deflection, queen c4, and rook h8 mate. Really cool combination. Charlotte Chess Center says, I've never seen this before. Yeah, this is a cool one. This is a cool one. And it's not very famous. I really, really like it. Okay. Back to the speedrun. So remember, f5 is not a panacea. It doesn't always solve your problems, but in this case, white is just out of pieces. Yeah, so white blundered the queen, and the game was over. Any questions? Okay, we'll play one last game, and then maybe we'll play a little bit more blitz before we wrap up. I'm still feeling the energy. Let's play a 5-minute game to wrap up the speedrun. Let's play a 5-minute game. Let's play a 5-minute game. We're playing a 1700. Let's go. E4, T5. We're facing the Scandi, and we're facing the, I think it's called the Portuguese variation, the modern variation. I don't know. But we faced this several times throughout the speedruns, and I've made a couple of recommendations. There's a lot of good lines here. You can play D4. The one thing that you shouldn't do, unless you play the Panov attack, is to go C4. You guys should know this. The move that I always recommend here is bishop to b5 check. It's just a very nasty little check. It forces black to basically to put a piece on d7, which by definition is going to be a very awkward piece. And now my coach many, many years ago suggested a line that's easy to learn. It's definitely not the best way for white to squeeze out an advantage, but it's an easy line to play. It's low maintenance, and it gives white a nice little advantage, and that's just to drop the bishop back to e2, and now to play the move d4. And now you get a nice pawn center, and black responds with knight c6. Now, knight c6 is a very, very sloppy move. Typically, you'll see black pushing e6 or c6 first, and the reason is these minor pieces they're unsupported. They don't have any pawns that are surrounding them, and so we can use our pawns, much like we did in that Alapin game, and stake a major claim in the center, starting with c4. c4 is pretty automatic here. And now, again, you have this choice. You can develop your pieces, but the ambitious move is to push d5. Why not, right? Why not? This is not a very committal move. Now you want to be careful how you continue, because bishop f4, for example, it's an okay move, but the knight can drop back to g6 with tempo. I think the deeper approach to the position is actually to play knight to f3, developing like this, with a very specific idea. Okay, black plays knight g6. My idea was that after the trade on f3, black would not be able to easily play the move e6, because after the trade on e6, the b7 pawn would hang. So I was trying to make it difficult for black to develop their pieces. Knight g6. And one idea I've talked about at great length in the speedrun is that whenever a knight appears on g6 like this, there should be an idea that kind of automatically occurs to you. And I think it's very, very powerful in this position because black is so cramped, and that's to shove this pawn up to h5. And we literally win the knight. Black played h6. Black should have played h5, and then I'll show you what to do after the game. But now we literally win the knight. It's just trapped on g6. We've had 2 trapped pieces like this, which just show us the importance of a space advantage. Again, now black plays e6, and now we have a further choice, again, between sort of the fundamental 2 approaches to converting a lot of extra material. The first is to keep pieces on the board and to play for checkmate. The second is just to trade off as much as possible, and that's what we're going to do here. We're kind of low on time, so we're just going to trade the queens. This is the boring method, but it's very, very effective if you don't get sloppy in the endgame. Now let's complete our development. Bishop b4. This pin is absolutely not scary. You don't have to rush with the move a3. You can just calmly complete your development. You don't care about the doubled pawns. I mean, we're up a piece, so all of this stuff is not important. Okay, so now the one thing that I would like to accomplish in this position is to get this king to a better spot, right? It's not that it's unsafe in the center, but the rook on a1 is not in the game. So we would love to castle queenside, but we can't do that because the rook is interfering with the d-file. So what can we put on the d-file that's stable and that it also achieves something else? Well, clearly it's the move knight d4. I mean, this should be pretty automatic to you. Now we're ready to castle queenside, and if need be, to eliminate the bishop on e6. Pretty easy play here. We're up a piece. Yeah, so now let's castle queenside. This also opens the door for the knight jumping into d5, assuming that black doesn't trade. And this is just completely winning. Completely winning. Yeah, trade on c3, so our opponent does take on c3. And where do we put our knight? Well, again, generally we're following the plan of encouraging as many trades as possible. So knight b5 and knight f5 are kind of my 2 instincts. I like knight f5 because it hits the g7 pawn. And if black takes on f5, we can just trade we can trade the rooks and then recapture on f5. Yeah, so we're just trading all the pieces here, leaving ourselves with the extra minor piece. Now, if we were to follow this plan to its logical conclusion, which we're going to do, you should see the move bishop h5, preparing to trade off the final pair of minor pieces. But as I've said before, when you're doing this type of plan, you also shouldn't be like dogmatic about trading everything off. If there's an easier path to victory, right? If the attack on the enemy king is slam dunk, then you shouldn't just like force yourself to trade stuff. It's not always the most efficient method. Here, it kind of is because we have easy ways to trade all the pieces, and this is totally winning. But it's not always going to be the easiest way to convert a big material advantage. You want to be flexible. So now the way that we're going to win is, well, it's pretty simple. First, we need to bring the king up because it's the endgame. Our opponent is not doing anything of substance on the king side. We just trade pawns. And now we can start hunting for black's weak pawns on the king side. The easiest way to do that is to go after the base of the pawn chain, which is why I want to go rook d8 and rook a8. Okay, black plays a6, so obviously now we go rook b8 and pick up this pawn, and then pick up this pawn, and then everything collapses. So let's take on b6. You can take anything you want, but king d3 is clinical. Why would we give up any pawns when we can just defend them? Yeah, we just take everything here. Rook a6. Rook can swing over to g6, and we can just start pushing the a pawn. Yeah. We don't need to take any more pawns. We can just push. Now we can take the pawn to cut off the king. And I think our opponent will resign. Okay, now let's take another pawn. The only thing to be careful about in these types of scenarios is obviously stalemate. Just keep an eye out. But as long as the king has b8 and a8, there's going to be no way for black to set up any kind of stalemating pattern. Which is why it's a good idea not to push a7. I mean, people make this mistake all the time. This is what causes these last second stalemates. It's when people push a7. So don't stalemate the enemy king unless you absolutely have to in this type of scenario. Watch how I'm converting this. Actually, it occurred to me that I can go rook d7, rook d8 and trade the rooks. So as long as the king is cornered, that's good. But don't overdo it by stalemating the king. Unless you've calculated, to checkmate or there's a specific situation. Yeah, that's it. Trade the rooks and promote the pawns with checkmate. Okay, so let's move the bishop back. Black has a pawn here, so I'm not worried about stalemate. Black has g3. And a8 queen checkmate. Okay. Again, fairly straightforward game because black blundered a piece in the opening. But even before that, black misplayed it pretty significantly. Yeah, so bishop e5, bishop d7, bishop e2. I'm not going to spend too much time on the theory here. The key moment comes here. Black has to play e6. This is the only serious move. And now typically you'll go knight f3. And in order to equalize, black has to play c5 as quickly as possible and fight for the center. But still, I like white's position here. c4, knight f6, knight c3. I've had a lot of games go like this. C takes d4. Queen takes d4 is a nice way to recapture. And if black develops the knight to c6, the queen can just sort of park itself either on h4 or on d3. And I actually think this is a pretty unpleasant structure for black because black is very cramped and people don't like to play positions where, their minor pieces are super, super cramped. Our development is excellent. We can get the bishop to f4. We can put a rook on d1. And white has a very simple plan of queenside expansion with a3 and b5, a3 and b4. The reason I'm biased in favor of this type of position is because it occurs in the Alapin. Believe it or not, in the Alapin, you can get a very similar position. If black plays c5 and black plays this line with d5 and knight f6, which actually I recommend when you face the Alapin. The chessable recommendation here is to give a check on b5, look familiar, knight b to d7, and now to play d4. And in the main line, a6, bishop e2, knight d5, knight f3, e6, you get essentially the identical structure, c4, knight f6, knight c3, and white is a smidge better. And it's a very difficult position to play for black. So you can see kind of the same exact pawn structure with the same exact plan of expanding on the queen side. And black has to play very, very carefully in order to equalize. So our opponent goes knight c6 instead, which is a very awkward move. It walks right into c4, knight f6. Yeah, and actually, according to the computer, I should have played knight f3 here. I should not have pushed d5 prematurely, and I should have just developed my pieces like so. And the knight on c6 is a horrible piece. Black has to contest the center with c7, c5. Here, white is much better. But instead, I played d5, which I thought was pretty reasonable, knight e5, knight f3. And as a matter of fact, black can equalize here with... Yeah, this is a very, very difficult sequence. Black actually is supposed to take on f3. And now an interesting moment. So if black plays e6, the correct move is e5, by the way, e5, which was the whole point of the move knight f3. It was to prevent black from pushing the e-pawn. But I simply didn't calculate far enough. I just trusted my intuition. I was like, okay, well, here I'm going to take on passant, and I'm going to take on b7. But when you actually look at this position, it becomes evident that the pawn on b7 cannot be easily captured. If you capture it here, black is going to trade queens and give a check on d8 and then recapture on c4 with an advantage. And so if you give a check on a4, black is going to cover it with a pawn. If you start with queen takes queen, then black is going to play rook takes queen. And again, it's the same type of thing where, yeah, you can take on b7, but black can play bishop takes c4, or even bishop to c5, and it's anybody's game. Yeah, it's not an obvious idea at all, but it really emphasizes the importance of not trusting your opponent's ideas. Like if your opponent plays a move and it's obvious why they played it, you should still ask yourself, well, can I still achieve what I wanted to achieve, which in this case is freeing the king side. Our opponent just kind of trusted us, knight g6, and walked right into h4, which is a really nasty move. Now black is in trouble. And I think black had to play h5, but this is sort of the logical follow-up to this h4, h5 idea. Now the knight on g6 is not well protected, and so you can slide the bishop up to d3. And this is an idea that you should write down or remember. You start with h4, you provoke h5, and then you slide the bishop up, and you're threatening to completely ruin black's kingside pawn structure with bishop takes g6. So for instance, if black plays e6, you don't have to do it immediately, right? So the engine says, let's castle first. And after something like bishop e7, now you trade on g6, and you immediately attack this pawn with knight e5. This is just a massacre. Horrible position for black. So actually, black's best move here was still to play e5. Very hard move to play because it also runs into h5. And here black can try to generate some counterplay, but this is a lousy position indeed. So our opponent just gave up the knight, and that was that. We took on e6, we traded all the pieces. We did exactly nothing that's extraordinary here. We literally just traded everything, followed the rules of endgames, and just notice here how patiently I'm playing. King d2, no reason to do anything drastic. a4, just advancing the pawn, and then at the right moment, infiltrating and starting to pick off your opponent's weak pawns. Just a sec. All right. Okay, any questions? What about bishop d4 instead of knight to castle? Not sure what you're at. Knight to castle, I'm not sure what that means. But this is a fairly straightforward game. All right, guys, let's get one last game in, bonus game, and then we'll play a little bit of blitz and call it a night. One more 5 in a game with black. Let's see if we can get a Najdorf. And it looks like we will. Yes, we will get a Najdorf. Excellent. Okay. And bishop e3, e5, which is a line that we have faced multiple times throughout the speedrun. And here, I remind you that there is a fork in the road, not literally a fork. Yeah, so white plays the positional line, which is knight f3. Previously, we faced the traditional main line, which is knight to b3, and in that line, white often goes queenside castle. That's like the exciting Najdorf line. Knight f3 is considered a more positional variation, because in this line, white actually typically castles to the king side. Black, again, has many, many ways that we can proceed here, but I'm going to play the sort of traditional main line, just developing the king side, bishop to e7, and quickly castling to the king side. The one important subtlety here is that you want to avoid bishop e6 because it runs into knight g5, and knight g5 is very, very nasty in this position. So this may seem like a concession, like allowing bishop c4, but again, you have to resist the urge to play bishop e6 prematurely. If you play it prematurely, white's going to trade on e6, white's going to jump into g5, and you're going to get into very, very big trouble with the b6 square and the e6 pawn. I'll show you after the game. Therefore, we have to castle first. Really important. h3. So to my knowledge, this is not a serious move. I mean, I don't know what white is doing. We were not intending to develop the bishop to g4. We were intending to eventually develop it to e6. And having castled, we can already play bishop e6. So again, you might be like, why is it important to castle first? I'll show you after the game. But now we basically have solved all of our opening problems. Bishop e6. And if white trades on e6, this is a very interesting pawn structure that it occurs in several different openings, not just in the Najdorf, but it may seem like a clunker, but in fact, if you can manage to keep the e6 pawn protected, this is a very positive, beneficial pawn structure for black. Because if you look at these pawns, they're kind of like a bumper on a car. They're controlling all of the key squares in the center, making it very hard for white's pieces to have any kind of purchase in the center. And most importantly, the d5 square is under control. So one of white's main ideas is disarmed. And finally, we get the semi-open f file, which can always be a positive if we're trying to attack. So lots of ways that black can play, but the most straightforward is just to complete the development with knight c6. You can, I mean, I know a lot of you are pining for d5, but you want to be very careful about when you play that move. And definitely we wouldn't want to go d5 here because simply we would drop the e5 pawn. Okay, knight a4. Knight b6 is not a threat. This is a very bad move. It just blunders a pawn. I think we can just take it. No reason not to. Yeah, knight b6, rook b8 is a total dead end for white. Complete dead end. c3. Ugh. Okay, now the knight on a4 is in serious trouble. So immediately I'm thinking about b5 and trying to gain material. Okay, so white does have a way to evacuate the knight, but it's really advanced. It's funny, after b5, knight b6, rook b8, white does have a really tricky little move that keeps white in the game. So in the speedrun, I try to play as objectively as possible. So even if there is a line that I don't think a 1700 will find, I'm still not going to go into it. And instead, we're going to expand in the center first with the move d5. Yeah, d5 is cool. Now we're threatening to play b5. And I'll show you the difference after the game. But white is completely busted here. Completely busted here. Yeah, white can also put a bishop on b6, but that doesn't do anything either. It actually helps our queen get to the king side. Okay, rook b1. Our opponent ignores the brewing massacre and walks into b5. And the point is, after knight b6, rook b8, we are threatening several different things. Obviously, the most straightforward threat is rook takes b6, which wins immediately. But we can also cut off the bishop from the knight several different ways. We can go d4. We can even go bishop c5. The knight on b6 is complete toast. Complete toast. Yeah, rook b8. And white's done for. And this is why I make such a pitch for the Najdorf. Like, we're winning out of the opening, and you don't get a lot of openings like that where you can just contend for victory right out of the opening. Okay, so which of the many possibilities should we opt for? Anything works here. But if you want to be greedy, which I most certainly am, I think the cleanest way to win the knight is bishop c5. This is a sort of the most thematic move because it literally cuts off the bishop and it leaves the knight all alone. Yeah, bishop c5. Game is over. Yeah, knight a4. White tries to give up the piece for maximum amount of material. Let's start by taking on e3. Just getting that out of the way. It's funny, we don't even have to take the knight if we don't want to. The knight isn't going anywhere. So if we want to be like super pedantic, what move should we make? If we want to be maximum greed, yeah, some of you are spotting rook f3, and that's a great move, but I just want to like keep your attention on this knight. If you want to take the knight without giving up a pawn, what should you do? I just want somebody to find this move. It's not knight a5. Knight a5, queen c2. Yeah, rook f3 is probably the best move in the position because it simplifies the king side. Yeah, I'm talking about queen a5. So if you wanted to be greedy, you would play queen to a5, and the knight is toast. But we're going to go for the flashy tactics with rook takes f3. And they're flashy, but they're also good because they simplify the game. They trade a bunch of pieces, and then we eat the knight for dessert. Kind of simplifying combination, eliminate the knight, and then stick our own knight on d2. Generally very commonly missed, these forks on d2 and d7 at this level. Okay, gf, wow, our opponent is trying to bring on the end of the game. Yeah, we can start with queen g5 check and then play knight d2, but let's not overcomplicate. Just, you know, queen g5 is not going anywhere. We can give this check on the next move. Yeah, it is a good idea to give this check just to get the queen into the right area of the board. Okay, now we can take either of the rooks, but I like knight takes f1 because it's a check. And finally, we can take the knight. Let's not dilly-dally any further. Okay, f4, whatever. We can just take. No, queen takes a4, rook takes b2 is just checkmate. So again, we're going to try to simplify as much as possible. White is going to decline the trade. And now we're going to win by bringing our pieces over to the king side and essentially checkmating white. Let's get the rook involved in the attack. I'm looking at this f4 pawn, and I'm identifying it as a major target, but the knight is currently not doing anything, and definitely is not doing what it should be doing, so let's get it into the attack. Knight e7. At this point, I'm basically abandoning these two pawns. I don't care about them, because I'm playing for checkmate. And I'm putting my faith in these three pieces. And I'm believing in the fact that even if I give up both of the a pawns, there is going to be a checkmate. Okay, and this is largely an intuitive judgment. I haven't done all the sufficient calculation yet. In a 10 or 15 minute game, yeah, I would spend some time making sure of this. Okay, so now we can attack slowly. We can push up the pawn to h4 and establish an outpost on g3. Remember, attack patiently. Don't try to do everything in one move. Slide the queen away, hit f4. Now we're threatening to capture with check. We're also looking out for a bunch of knight forks. All right, okay, I think it's a good time to stick the knight on h4. Now I'm just going to quickly slide my king away to h8 so that there are no sudden checks. And that's it. White is boxed up. Okay, whatever, b3 trade. And now let's deliver the final blow, e5. Okay, again, million ways that we can win this game. I like the move e4. And the knight is coming into f3. And we win another piece. Let's trade. Let's take. Let's push f2. Let's push f1. Let's checkmate him with queen f2. again, a simple game. I mean, the final stage of the game was not particularly interesting, but you can see that if you're watching this and you're like 1700 blitz, again, I'm not saying no 30 moves of theory, but I basically made all the standard opening moves and I was winning. I didn't do anything that requires like grandmaster level knowledge in the Najdorf. I just played standard theoretical moves and immediately white blundered. You're going to win insane amounts of games just if you know like the basics of whatever opening you play. So knight f3, bishop e7. And the first important moment is here. After bishop c4, I've talked previously about like why the move e5 is acceptable, why the d5 square isn't the only factor here. I'm not going to go through that again. You can watch my previous Najdorf videos to find that out. But what I will say is that bishop e6 here is a very common... Actually, it's not a mistake, but it leads to a relatively dubious position. White can trade on e6 and stick the knight on g5. And if you play queen to c8, then suddenly white moves the queen up to f3. And what is the idea of this move? The idea is that h6 is met with queen h3. This is why black needs to castle first. Like, this would be invalidated if black's king were castled because he would be able to take the knight. But here, suddenly, black has no good way to defend e6. So black actually does equalize with queen d7, but this is not the kind of line that I would recommend. Queen f3, things get very sharp here. White can castle to the queen side, and the queen is walking over to h3. So this is actually why you castle and then play bishop e6. By the way, h3 is already a waste of time. h3 is already a waste of time. Yeah, the main move here is short castle. Now bishop e6. White typically plays bishop to b3, trying to trade on his own terms. And here the recent move, yeah, b5 equalizes. A lot of moves equalize for black. Knight c6 is the main line, but the engine actually likes queen to c8, which is kind of a new move. There was a game from 2021. Two grandmasters. White played knight d5. Black played knight takes d5. Bishop takes d5. Bishop takes d5. Pretty boring stuff. Bishop d5, queen d5. And in this position, you have to know this idea, queen c6. It's simple equality here. Queen c6. White played c4. And now the knight gets around to f6. So black equalizes here as well. This is why this is kind of an innocuous line. Okay, so white played h3. And we responded with bishop e6. And now we're no longer afraid of the trade. And I think after the trade, white is already worse. Like here, we're already better. And the computer actually confirms this. White has to play bishop b3. This is kind of the main idea of the line. And actually here, the engine likes knight c6, which sort of violates one of the main rules of the Najdorf, which is that typically the knight goes to d7 for many reasons. But here, knight d7 is almost never played because it's almost always a blunder because of this idea. And you just have no way to defend e6. So that's why in this specific variation, often, typically black goes knight c6, and then the knight actually jumps out to a5, hoping to encourage white to take on e6. But white's usually not going to do that. White's going to play a move like queen e2, and the position is just equal. Black can grab the bishop pair, and black can play a move like h6, just covering the g5 square, and we're doing great here. Queen c8, we can slowly start preparing d5. So, yeah, nothing dangerous here, but our opponent traded. We simply developed our pieces, and boom, the game is already over after knight takes e4. The last thing I'll point out is that b5 is actually a mistake. It's premature because after knight b6, rook b8, who can spot the crafty little way that white can get this knight out of the pickle? How does white get the knight out of the pickle? Yeah, very good. Knight to d5. So this is the move that I was trying to prevent by playing d5. This is just pattern recognition. Like, how do I see this? Well, there's no answer to that question. It's just pattern recognition. I just spotted this idea because the moment f takes e6 was played, I paid closer attention to tactics that occur on this diagonal. So knight d5 is kind of annoying, and, well, white doesn't lose the knight. Of course, black doesn't have to take on d5 and give back the pawn, but you can play a move like king h8, and black is still very much in control. But this is why I tried to start with d5. Now, maybe white has some way to save the game, or to save the knight, but I don't think so. And after b5, rook b8, the game is over. Bishop c5, we can, of course, play rook takes b6. This is also totally winning. This is also winning. Lots of moves are winning. d4 is the one move I would not recommend because you give up e6 with a check. So remember, when you're trying to interfere between two pieces that are defending each other, you don't always have to do it with a pawn. You can do it with a piece. And people often forget that. They're only looking for moves like d4, and they forget that a piece can just as effectively interfere with two pieces that are defending each other. So just to cap off this speedrun episode, I've shown you this example before, but just to make sure that this concept is fully solidified in your brain, in which with the black pieces, I played rook takes f2. Blundering, what nasty little tactic. Yeah, bishop f3 is exactly right. So anytime you have a situation where two pieces are protecting each other and there's a long distance between them, you should be looking for these types of interference tactics like bishop f3. Black simply loses in exchange because sadly, you don't have the knight fork. The rook guards that square. So I had to give up the exchange and I lost the game. And that's all I have for you folks. Thanks for watching the speedrun episode. See you guys later.